Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. It's nice to see you all here in, I think, the final session, before the final session. We can't really follow Maurice Glasman in any meaningful way, but we'll try. If you think some of the stuff he said there was radical, I was sitting next to him at dinner last night. Unfortunately, it was all off the record. I think you'll all agree it's been a fabulously interesting conference, and what an apposite venue here. The old GLC building, Red Ken's lair. I think after Margaret Thatcher abolished the GLC in order to put pay to the idea for as long as possible, this building, little known fact, was hired out for the use of sniffer dog training, given the miles of anonymous corridors that we had here. So yeah, if any columnists in the audience and you want to use that as your intro, be careful how you use it. This is one of those nitty-gritty sessions. We've had many wonderful broad brush conversations today, visionaries painting the ideas surrounding post-Brexit Britain in primary colours. We've also had some quite technical discussions, of course, about the intricacies of trade policy and so on. I think this panel falls somewhere in the middle because there are big philosophical issues here at play when we talk about deregulation. But we have amassed on the panel some real expertise among various sort of subsectors of deregulation. Matt Ridley, Lord Ridley, of course, who writes for The Times, well known for particularly for his writing on environmental policy. We've got James Sproul from the IOD, chief economist at the IOD, who deals obviously a lot in labour market regulation and other forms of product regulation. Barney Reynolds, Shearman & Sterling are one of our sponsors today. Thank you very much for that. Who's really blazed a trail in the last year with his writings on the city, some very influential work, particularly for the Politeia think tank. And then we have an old political chum of mine, Steve Bates, who's the CEO, of course, of the UK Bioindustry Association. We're going to keep this as sharp and punchy as possible. I see there's a lot of interested parties in the audience, so we'll be going to questions quite quickly. And I'm just going to give each of our panelists just a couple of minutes, a throat clearer, as we say informally, to say how they see the regulatory landscape pre and post Brexit. Matt Ridley.
I think everybody agrees that regulation is necessary. The question is, can it sometimes go too far, and has it particularly gone too far in the European Union, and does Britain have an appetite to do it less and better? And I've seen some very interesting things being written in the last couple of months by people like Sir Venki Ramakrishnan, the President of the Royal Society, Louise Richardson, Vice Chancellor of Oxford University, Neil Woodford, Sir Mike Rawlins, people like that, saying, actually, yes, now we've agreed that Brexit is happening, there are ways in which we could be more liberal and more efficient and more quick about regulating. A couple of examples of EU regulation that has gone much too far and done real harm rather than just not doing good. Vaping, electronic cigarettes, coming into force next month, new directive on vaping that effectively bans advertising, bans the use of particular sized products, etc., and has effectively brought to a halt already the rapid increase in vaping at the expense of smoking in this country, which was saving lives on a pretty spectacular scale, one suspects. GM crops, the other example, where we know that because we basically gave up on these crops in Europe 15 years ago, as a result we're using more insecticides in this continent than they do, say, in Brazil, where they have BT crops that are insect resistant, for example. One of the particular features about European regulation in the environmental field in the last recent years has been that it's been hazard-based rather than risk-based. That's to say, it measures the toxicity of something, not the toxicity times the exposure, which is, of course, the crucial thing. Are you actually exposed to it much? If it's toxic, that you need to take that into account. That's in contrast to the US system. It's also taken into account in the Lisbon Treaty the precautionary principle, which basically says that we must measure the potential risks of an innovation, but we don't take into account the potential benefits of an innovation. And that needs to be balanced, in my view, and this is an idea that is getting traction in Brussels and ought to get traction here post-Brexit, by something called the innovation principle. which is the idea that every regulation must also be assessed not just for the risk to people, but for the risk to innovation, to the possibility that it might hinder and stifle innovation. And an example of, we never know quite how much innovation is being stifled by regulation, but an example I was given just yesterday is that somebody had estimated if we want to develop a new chemical to control blackgrass, which is a problem weed in agriculture, you would have to address 40,000 pages of regulation before you could be sure that you could sell that product. Another example where the gene editing is a technology with fantastic applications in agriculture as well as medicine, and in that case the Americans have decided this is not genetic modification because there's no new DNA introduced. It is therefore not to be regulated as such. The European Union has taken a decision not to take a decision. It has taken a decision to ask the member states not to decide how they're going to regulate this until it's made up its mind in a couple of years. Now that is a terrible signal to send to innovators. Two final points, because I know you're pushing me. First is that big business loves regulation, and the second is that back in that place across the river, when the Great Repeal Bill comes, a lot of people are worried that Tories like me are going to use it as an opportunity to
fire sale, yeah,
to do a fire sale of regulation and kill babies. There's just as big a risk that it will be used to gold plate legislation on behalf of vested interests.
That brings us nicely to James. A great repeal bill, a great reacquisition bill, we may see.
Yeah.
What would you say? I mean, obviously, a lot of your members are going to want, let's deregulate as much as we can. Would it be a political mistake, do you think, to try and use that to get changes through on the nod?
I think we face a real difficult time here. One of the difficulties we face is that we have obviously a lot of populism, both here in the UK, but we've seen it obviously in the United States as well. And for a lot of politicians, regulation is the solution to this populism. People have concerns, I'll regulate. And therefore, what you're fighting against, and IOD members and small businesses in general don't like regulation because they have an HR department, it might be one person. So when you put on more employment legislation, it's a real burden on one person. But for a lot of politicians, it's I'm giving you action and I'm addressing your concerns. And I'm doing it in a way with lots of unintended consequences, sure, but I'm still able to say I'm giving you action. So is there a regulatory way to address the concerns about people that have about globalization? And you add into that a couple of things which I think are really, really harming our economy in the longer term. One of them is that, of course, Europe is an aging society, both ourselves but also the rest of the EU. And older people tend to be, well, probably not quite as brave or as embracing of change as we might like. And that spills over into a lot of labour market reform. Now, a lot of the problems with labour market reform are not, in fact, EU-based. They're nation-state-based. That's not to say they're not a big problem, though. And we see the complete lack of entrepreneurialism around, if you look around the world, the least, bottom third least entrepreneurial countries in the world are all European, with two exceptions, and those exceptions are Russia and Japan, which nobody thinks of as being entrepreneurial. And it's not just that they don't start businesses, they also don't get entrepreneurial within businesses. So you can obviously have people who are within a big business, but they see the opportunity to develop new products or push new divisions. That doesn't happen either, and that's a real problem. I've got a couple of solutions and then I'll wrap up.
Very good.
One is, right now, of course, if you look at regulation for a civil servant, there's no downside to overregulation, to gold plating. And in fact, there's an enormous positive incentive to do that, because if you gold plate, well then, you'll never be gotten after for not having implemented. What we need is businesses and individuals who could sue or press the government to legally enforce regulation, to press them exact opposite way, to say, you overinterpreted this, and to allow a mechanism by which you, the civil servant, had to say, I've got to balance these two things.
Or sunset clauses, maybe?
Sunset clauses, but also the ability to take these people to court and say, no, this was supposed to address this issue, and you've decided to address 10 other supplementary issues. The unintended consequences are significant. In the exact same way that if you under-regulated and there were problems, you could sue the government to implement.
When we come back to you, James, I'm going to ask you about how can we square the sort of big political themes of people voting for Brexit because they were scared about globalization, with, on the other hand, other people thinking that Brexit's going to make us a more competitive economy. So I'm sure, I know you've thought deeply about that. Barney.
So financial services is slightly different perhaps from other areas because of the credit crunch, so the 2007 and 2008 crisis, as a result of which there's a lot of popular feeling that financial institutions need to be reined in, and that's been reflected in Europe in the Barnier post-credit crunch reforms. The UK had massive influence into those. They were written basically on a template of a Brit, Lord Turner, the head of the FSA at the time. But they were massively embellished in the EU, and then some bits of them were gold-plated because the EU hadn't done them enough. The traditional style of regulation for financial services in the UK is higher standards than elsewhere, but fewer rules and much more judgment-based regulation. That works. At the moment, we got the worst of both worlds because we've got that, and in conjunction with that, we've got all the prescriptive standards of the EU. And the reason for that is that the EU legislative architecture is mistrustful of member states and mistrustful, particularly under the Barnier regime as Financial Services Commissioner of the UK. And so in order to deal with that point, what they've effectively put in place is a sort of instruction manual that's embellished and added to it all the time, sort of real time almost, for the regulators, which take away regulatory discretion from our regulators, where if you want to clarify the meaning of something, you have to go through a massive Q&A process that takes months, and if you want to change it, you have to go back through Brussels. That actually has introduced massive systemic risk into the market because the regulators not only are disempowered by having this massive prescription, but they can't interpret it, they can't change the rules themselves. And so they're phenomenally weakened, and it makes the financial centre much more dangerous as a result. And in particular, a lot of the rules are made by countries that have no financial market or who don't see the market in the way that we do, which is the benefit of having a free market in itself, the need to be dynamic in regulation. A lot of EU countries see regulation or the markets as being something that serve industrial policy. So we now need to revisit our system, and we need to do it against a backdrop of a political environment where people are suspicious of financial institutions in helping the real economy, and the politicians need to be able to help us navigate that. I do believe at the top of our country there are now people who can understand this point, but we need to help them do it and to navigate it very quickly, because by the end of the Brexit 2 years, on a worst case scenario of no deal by the end of those 2 years, we need a positive story to sell to the institutions of why stay here. And one of the positive things is we strip away this nonsense. We make the markets actually safer, but we make it much more profitable for the banks and institutions at the same time. So we need to be able to do things our own way. We need to remove red tape, and we need any agreement with the EU to cover EU-facing rules only, which is what the US requires of anyone wanting an arrangement with it, so that we can do what we want for domestic and rest of world business.
Thank you, Barney. Steve, just tell us the scope of your association first for people who aren't specialised in your sector.
So I think you've got me on here because most of my companies in the association do drug development, drug discovery, work in the medicines field. That's in part because, as Matt says, we've not got a GM agricultural businesses in Europe because although we have fantastic research institutes like Rothamsted, nobody turns that into real businesses here partly because of the regulatory rules. I'm going to start with an opportunity from regulation and picking up from Maurice Glassman, what can we learn from history? It's not just the Tudors, but it was the Victorians who were very good at setting new sets of rules. And we're at a period of time here which I consider to be before the Royal Commission and Gauge Act of 1846, which was obviously the thing that set the standard for the railway gauge, which has stood its test of time. UK had first mover advantage in that. There was a big row about what the standard should be. But at the moment, we're having lots of discovery in engineered biology and gene editing techniques like CRISPR. Somebody in the world is going to set the standards in some of this bio stuff that's going to be important for the next century. It's not clear who that is, but the UK has some academic leads here. And if we turn that into regulatory leads, people quite like playing games where we set the rules, and we do it well. When we did rugby, football, less good with cricket, take your pick. But I like the Gauge Act, but there is an opportunity. So the big opportunity is how do we get that right? If you understand, there's an organisation called the National Institute of Biological Standards and Control, which is just outside London, and it does 95% of the world's international standards and reference materials for biologics. You think of the meter that's in Paris, which is the standard meter.
Yeah.
If you're doing a biologic, that standard, which has to be measured against, comes from Mill Hill. So, or old days Mill Hill, they've moved now. We do that very well. This stuff enables us to set the rules, and then you can build business off the back of it. So we should think heavily about areas of the future where we can set some rules.
But just so I'm clear, what is it about being inside the EU that means we can't do that now, but we could do it more outside the EU?
No, I'm saying that's where we do it now within the EU.
Yeah.
It would be very important to do it even more outside the
Okay.
EU. The thing that we're going to change with the EU in medicines is obviously we've had standardised medicines for my lifetime, since thalidomide really,
Yes.
in Europe. We're now going to lose being part of that system, probably, depending on how it works. And that then puts us in a position where we go from being an influential voice, very much like financial standards, in one of the two global regulators that matter, the EMA and the FDA in my world, and we drop into a second division
yeah.
like Switzerland, Canada, or others. Now, that is quite that gives us some challenges or potentially some opportunities. But broadly, the global market, the globalised nature of drug market means that people will still need to make to FDA and EMA standards. We now lose our voice formally if we choose to go that route in that discussion. Therefore, we need to think about other areas where the rules can be built.
Very good. Matt, you're obviously a card-carrying policy wonk, if I may say so, but also well known for your political antenna. How dangerous is this great repeal bill in the sense that there may be concerns among floating voters, among people who maybe are attracted to voting for your party, but maybe not, that this repeal will be used as an opportunity to scrap a lot of the environmental regulations that many people out there feel in the mainstream are good for us? And how many of those regulations came from the EU anyway?
Well, that's a hard question to ask until we've seen the Great Repeal Bill, but I do think that it was one of the things in the back of Theresa May's mind when she called the election. She hadn't entirely had an easy passage of the Article 50 bill through the House of Lords in particular. We did amend it, send it back to the Commons. They overrode our amendments and we then backed down, which is the way it's supposed to work. But that was just, in a sense, a preamble of what would happen in the Great Repeal Bill, where inch by inch, both houses, but particularly the Lords, would go through and say, well, actually, these regulations ought to be upgraded while we're nationalising them, and perhaps we ought to... and meanwhile, you've got in the background huge vested interests here, the NGOs, the civil servants who administer them, who are budget maximisers in public choice theory, and so on. And so I think the idea of getting a mandate for this Great Repeal Bill was an appealing part of going for an election, because otherwise she was going to face guerrilla warfare in Parliament that was going to make things tricky. Waving the bloody shirt of the risks from deregulation will be something that the opposition will do both during the election and over the next few years. And we, the people on the other side of the argument need to have an answer to that. And one of my answers is waving the bloody shirt of over-regulation, which I just did.
Shouldn't we just, as the parliamentarian on the panel though, shouldn't we just sort of all agree,
very low grade
all agree to hold fire, keep our powder dry? This should be a porting process rather than a process of nipping and tucking and changing things here and there. Shouldn't it just be a straight cut and paste as we onshore these laws, and then in the sunlit uplands, when it's all up to the UK Parliament, we can, in the normal way, over a series of electoral cycles, decide what we want to and we don't want to do? Shouldn't we just say nothing is going to change? Otherwise, we're going to get completely bogged down. The whole process will run into the sand.
Yes, and I think that's exactly what David Davis was saying this morning, if you listen carefully.
Yeah.
He said he was essentially saying we should promise to nationalise the acquis without changing with the dot on an I or a comma.
But do folk believe that in Parliament?
But, well, I think once it's in the manifesto and once an election, if an election is won by the Conservative Party, which is a possibility, I understand, then you would be able to get that through Parliament that much more easily. And
Yeah.
whenever Labour or the Liberal Democrats say, while we're at it, let's change this regulation, you say, no, we're not changing anything.
You're going to have your chance.
Yeah, that will come later.
Okay. James, the great imponderable, the idea of anti-globalisation, gains from regulation, particularly with labour standards. I know this is very much front and centre in your mind.
Absolutely, and there's an enormous question as to how much does the average person really want the deregulation? You know, here am I, the comfortable metrosexual. I think it'd be absolutely fantastic, but I appreciate that I am not necessarily Mr. and Mrs. Average Briton living in the Midlands and just slightly worried about my job, just slightly worried about the implications that a lot of this stuff would have. I'm much more comfortable with the competitive world that this points to than the average person is. And I think that there are a lot of reasons why people voted to leave, and it really was a coalescence of a whole bunch of interests. And it's arguable that it would only came through the timing was absolutely perfect for those levers to come through between people who were voting because they didn't want immigration, people who were voting because they were actually globalists. I was chatting to Dan Hannan earlier, and clearly a completely convinced globalist who was voting to leave in order to become more globalist, whereas others are voting to leave to stop being more globalist. And you sort of have to wonder, how do they end up in the same camp? But never mind, they did.
So do you think labour standards will just stay pretty much roughly where they are?
I say there's a wonderful phrase used by Bill Gates all the time that technology's impact is overestimated in the short term and underestimated in the long term. I think it's exactly the same thing here. We are going to see not very much difference in the short term, but in the long term, quite a lot. And that's, I think, actually, and I'll just close on this, I think the economics profession is going for 0 for 3. The first prediction they made was that we would have a disaster the second we left the voted to leave. Well, they got that one wrong. They then, having got that one wrong, they've written their forecasts up a lot for the next couple of years. I think they probably over-egged that one. But they said, don't worry, it's going to be an absolute disaster longer term. And again, wrong again. So I think it's actually going to be 0 for 3 on the economics. By the way, all 3 times I did the opposite one of those, but then I tend to be slightly contrarian.
We've actually only got, haven't got very long left. Barney, could I very quickly ask you, just one minute. Under WTO rules, if we go to WTO rules without a FTA, will the city be okay?
Yes. There is, for WTO rules, there's basically countries can do what they want and the EU can do what it wants more or less, because there's a so-called prudential carve-out, which means they can basically use that as an excuse to write almost anything they want. But effectively, a financial centre is not dependent on access. Traditionally, people come to the market. What we actually need to do, is the point Jeff Sprecher made earlier on the Euro clearing panel, is facilitate the customers coming here, put all our efforts into that, rather than start thinking about how we continue the status quo because it's somehow got sanctity. That's the mistake. One other thing. We do need to look at, I think, just picking up on what Matt says, our guys can over-regulate as well as the next people. For financial services, we used to have an international competitive requirement, a competitiveness requirement for regulation, which we need to reinstate, subject, of course, to financial stability concerns, and we need to remove the a priori regulation for competition purposes, which came through the EU, which is a complete mistake, because you need to let the markets evolve, identify the mischief, and then deal with that, rather than trying to let economists come up with whether or not you've got a perfect market before you've even got one.
Steve, I'll bring you in a moment. Forgive me. Ladies and gentlemen, any questions? You have a lot of firepower up on the stage, despite my presence. Gentleman there.
Go back to a principle-based approach. I'm thinking of the City Code on Takeovers and Mergers, which has been a huge success for the UK. And its principles, it's pragmatic, it's flexible, but the broad principle with a few rules underlining it seems to me the formula to adopt. And I was just wondering what the panel thought about that as an approach, not just for financial services, but it could include generic pharmaceuticals and other major industry groups, which we happen to be quite good at, by the way.
We're going to take that along with Simon Wolfson's question behind you, and you're going to go first, Steve, on the gentleman's.
Yeah, I'm going to do something that I've never ever done before, which is take issue with Matt Ridley. Not all big business loves...
I thought you were going to sing a song.
No, I could do that as well. But not all
We've
big
not
business
seen
loves
it, though.
regulation. Really, there are some big... I don't know if we qualify as a big business, but we definitely don't like regulation. So, but I think what is definitely true is that big business can learn to cope with regulation. And one of the things that, when politicians say, well, what regulations would you like to get rid of? Us businessmen tend to sort of sit around and scratch our head and we can't instantly think of them, although newts is the one that I always have in reserve for that. But one of the things that I think is actually the biggest burden of regulation is not dealing with existing regulation, it's adapting to new regulation. And that is actually where the vast majority of work comes, is gathering all the data, writing all the nonsense that's got to go into your annual report and all the rest of it. And so if there's anything that could be done, or if you've got any ideas as to how we could slow down the volume of new regulation, that would be enormously helpful.
Leave the European Union?
Well, this
For
is
instance?
in my sector, this is one of the biggest concerns, that we go from a simple system which worked all across Europe to potentially having two systems, and that doubles the work, and potentially the UK system then becomes one, even if it was speedier, fast, more deregulated, would be different. And if global companies, the question as to where they put their investment and where they put places is something that we're managing at the moment. And I think we've lost a competitive advantage as a result of the European Medicines Agency leaving London rather than gained one. So we need to think and reimagine ourselves in a different way. And people are not arguing for yet another different type of medicines regulation, really. We do have good examples of gold plating in the UK. If you look at the one that I like is that the standard sizes for caged animals in research is bigger in the UK than anywhere else, a good example of gold plating. And the interpretation of the UK clinical trial regulation, speedily and fast, destroyed our industry for the best part of 5 or 6 years. And we should remember that we can get it wrong here. And if you look at whether we're going to have adoption of this in our society, you only have to look at the interpretation in Scotland, where we've had freedom on GM crops and it's been banned by the Scottish Parliament, to see that these are debates that will then need to be won if we're going to be scientifically led. It's not just Europe that can be non-scientific. We have form ourselves of doing that as well. So we're going to have to win this properly. Could we go back to a simpler base of rules? Perhaps, but you run the risk of, do you want simple but different, and is that worth it versus same and same?
Barney?
I think you can have both. I agree with going back to principles and outcomes-based regulation, with regulators, heavy-hitting regulators exercising proper judgment. I don't think it involves creating a new system and a set of standards. They can be the same standards, in fact, with a couple of gold plates if they're really required, but then it can fit into EU and US standards, but without all the prescription. And that would make us a lot more nimble, and I think that's where we need to be heading.
James, any final thing that you want to say? And then to Matt?
Just very quickly, coming back to Simon on his point about what we can do to slow down the volume, I heard a very interesting point this morning about the New Zealand Productivity Commission, Permanent Productivity Commission, whose job is to look at regulation and see if they're getting in the way, and if so, challenge them. So to set up a bureaucracy with the incentive of challenging regulation is, I think, the way to do it. That's partly what I meant by the innovation principle. It's the same idea in a different form.
Didn't the Kiwis years ago, I remember writing about this in my economics A-level, the salary of the central banker was inversely linked to the rate of inflation? Couldn't we have a productivity commission? The salary of the board is inversely linked. And actually they get bonuses for killing regulations off. Just a thought, I give that to you.
Yeah, and sunset clauses, which you mentioned earlier.
Ladies and gentlemen, this ridiculously short amount of time, I'd like to thank our four panellists. There really is an astonishing range of knowledge up on this panel here. All I've tried to do in the last, it seems like 15 minutes, is just give you a flavour, grab them as they go out, grab them over coffee, and thank you very much for listening.